Thanks, and it's a real honor to be invited to speak. I'm like you. I'm a little bit of a latecomer to the Sherlockian world, but a lifelong Sherlock lover. I just was unaware that there are other people I could talk to about my problem, and so I've been getting into it with gusto. And I'm a scientist who lives in America, but I'm Australian, so they say talk about what you know about. So as I get into Sherlockian research, I've decided to pick one of those two sides to go with, and I went with Australia for this. And it's a real honor to be here today and have an opportunity to talk to everyone. Conan Doyle had a lot of different connections with Australia, and so did Sherlock Holmes. So I'm going to give a few examples of those intersections and really take a look at how we see Sherlock in the Australians in the canon, and what we can and ask whether or not that was a really appropriate and reasonable representation of Australians. I was the very first Sherlockian meeting I went to, believe it or not, was the Sherlock Holmes and British Empire meeting. I went to lots of Zoom ones before that, but none of those, of course, none in person until 2022. And there was a wonderful presentation by Hartley Nathan about Canada and Canadians in the canon that really inspired me to think about this. And he argued that there are no bad Canadians in the canon. And I think, as I will show you, but I think as you already probably know, there are lots of bad Australians in the canon. So Australia's used a little bit differently to Canada by Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle visited Australia, but that visit took place well after all the Sherlock Holmes stories had been written. It was really a spiritualist talking tour. He did more than just spiritualist things. In fact, it was a real marathon through Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and he went to New Zealand as well, which only gets mentioned once in the canon, I'm happy to say, as an Australian. But he spent months in Australia. You can see him here holding a little possum. He published on it. And I was in Adelaide last year for a science meeting and went to see the Grand Central Hotel where he stayed, which is now a grand car park instead. Not an uncommon occurrence, unfortunately. But if you go and stand outside the Hungry Jack's fast food restaurant, in the bottom, you can see there is actually a plaque there. And if you take a look at my blog, you can learn a little bit more about that. And there's an article in this journal here called the Passengers Log, which is published by the Sydney Passengers. So if you want to know more about Australia and the Sherlockian world of Australia, the Sydney Passengers, that's led by Bill Barnes, is a really great group, and you can join them and receive their publication that happens a few times a month. But my real focus on Conan Doyle in Australia has been around who these people were in The Wanderings of a Spiritualist, book that he published, that he met along the way. And so I'm sort of working on writing biographies of each of the people that Conan Doyle mentions in his book one by one. And, just the first four people that he met when he got to Adelaide, his first port of call. Victor Cromer was a spiritualist he held a seance with. Thomas Belchambers was a naturalist, and he went out to his farm to understand whether he'd been able to commune with nature and what he'd learned from living in the wilderness. Arthur Thomas was actually the projectionist at the town hall who projected or displayed the spiritualist photographs that Conan Doyle was speaking to, and actually observed a strange phenomenon with one of the photographs. And this person is really called Dr. Watson. Conan Doyle had dinner with him in Adelaide, and these two have got stories published and coming out in the Passengers Log. In each issue, I hope to have another biography of each of these people as we move along through the book. But Sherlockian activities might be new to me. Obviously, they're not new to Australia. And in fact, one of the first Sherlockian activities, which is covered in this wonderful BSI book called Australia and Sherlock Holmes, which you can still buy, it's not sold out, is this photograph of a group of Australian miners performing as dancing men. And this photograph spells out the word, it turns out Lakeside, because the G here is inappropriately done. It's meant to be Lakeside. There is no K in the alphabet. Ross Davies has got a wonderful presentation he gives about utilizations of the alphabet. But it wasn't really clear where these miners were from who were performing the poses here. But if we focus in, this photograph was taken by H. Gross. It was actually mailed to Conan Doyle and published in The Strand, and they asked people to decode the text. Turns out H. Gross was Henry Herman Gross, a photographer based in the true desert wilderness of Western Australia. And once we start looking into that, we've been able to show that there are photos indeed of the Lakeside mine taken by Henry Gross. And so we've been able to nail down through the photographer exactly where these early 1904 or so Sherlockians were living in Australia when they took this pretty neat photo, pretty cool idea that's been reproduced by Sydney Sherlockians since then, organised by Bill Barnes. You can also have a lot of fun asking about Sherlock and Australians and the intersections they may have had. If we look into the newspapers, you can see in 1893, the Australian cricket team, of course, was touring England. And this is a wonderful photo that was taken by Russell and Sons of Baker Street. Now, whether it was taken on Baker Street or not is something I'm working on at the moment, but I love the idea that perhaps Sherlock and Watson, certainly Watson would have absolutely stormed down the stairs to meet the Australian cricket team if he heard they were on his street. If you zoom in here to this gentleman on the right-hand side of the photo and looking through the window, one wonders who this person is here and whether it was perhaps an enthusiastic Watson. There's also a really nice example in 1908 of a kangaroo getting out of the London Zoo, probably an overly cliched story, but believe it or not, when it got out of the zoo, it was run to ground in an area of a house in Baker Street. And I really love the idea of Mrs. Hudson perhaps all in a flap while Watson chased a kangaroo around the plane tree in the backyard of Bait 221B or 221 Baker Street. But when we look at the stories themselves, and let's have a look and ask about the people that we see and how they were represented in the canon. So we've got the Sign of Four was the first of 7 stories that mentions Australia or includes Australians. And it was only a brief mention where Watson's looking at the digging taking place to unearth the treasure. And he says, I've seen something like these little molehills on the side of a hill near Ballarat where prospectors had been at work. I think the first, and that's, I actually believe Watson was Australian and born in Australia, which is how he, as a young man, he managed to see, a young boy, he managed to see this. 1891, the Boscombe Valley Mystery. There's probably the most Australian story in the canon. Charles McCarthy is murdered. He's an Australian. His son, John McCarthy, plans to marry the girl next door, Alice Turner. Alice's dad made his money in Australia and let a property to Charles. So we have these Australian neighbors living side by side back in England in 1891. And it turns out, after investigation, of course, that John was Black Jack of Ballarat, who'd held up a stagecoach for gold, spared McCarthy, the driver, and returned to England rich. McCarthy somehow turns up in England as the villain instead of the victim, blackmailing Turner blackmailing and haunting Turner really all of his life. And he got this wonderful phrase, which is cooey, which for those of you who don't know, cooey is not something that's said, it's something that's shouted, cooey. It's a way you call people across long distances when you're out in the bush. And as I said, it's a distinctly Australian cry and one used between Australians, but really it can be used between anyone. And if you're calling someone, feel free to use cooey, no matter where you live in the world. The third story, The Adventure of Gloria Scott, is the one that inspired the name of the Sherlockian Society, the Sydney Passengers. It was Holmes's first case. It was told in 1893 by Watson. And at the time that this case took place, Holmes was visiting his friend Victor Trevor's father. And it transpires through the story that Victor Trevor's father was one of the convicts who participated in a planned mutiny on the Gloria Scott ship while being transported to Australia. During the mutiny, it went a little wrong, and they rescued a crew member, Hudson, and then they were all picked up and taken to Sydney, some convicts and Hudson, the crew member. They assumed new identities, made their fortune in the Australian gold rushes, and returned to England as pillars of the community. But Hudson, the victim, now turns up the villain and blackmails them and haunts them. You can see a little bit of similarity here in terms of plot elements of a returning from Australia enriched, but also the victims becoming victimizers. And there's a lovely description of this Australian. He was a man of little culture, but with a considerable amount of rude strength, physically and mentally. He knew hardly any books, but he had travelled far. Thick-set, burly, grizzled brown hair, beaten face, blue eyes, keen to the verge of fierceness. And I read out these quotes because we're going to talk a little bit about where Conan Doyle may have gotten some of these inspirations from in terms of describing Australians. The Empty House is a fourth story here, really side mention the Honourable Ronald Adair, who was a victim and happened to be the son of the Earl of Maynooth, at that time the governor of one of the Australian colonies. And they were back in England because of an operation for a cataract, which of course would have required a cataract knife. And then The Adventure of the Priory School in 1904. Australia only comes up right at the end of this story after the case has been solved. James Wilder is an illegitimate son of the Duke of Holderness, and he kidnaps the Duke of Holderness's legitimate son, to try and force him to change his will in his favor. The kidnapping went wrong. A teacher was killed accidentally, and the Duke agrees to help the illegitimate son cover up that crime. Um, and of course, he's told that, keeping James Wilder around is only going to result in continued trouble. And what do you do with trouble? He shall leave me forever and go to seek his fortune in Australia. Abbey Grange, 1904, Eustace Brackenstall's found dead. It turns out that Lady Mary Brackenstall was secretly meeting with Captain Crocker, who she met when she was sailing from Australia to England on a ship. Crocker and she fell in love, but she was stuck with this awful man, Sir Eustace Brackenstall. Was surprised. Crocker was surprised by Sir Eustace and killed Sir Eustace in self-defense. Lady Mary and her nurse were both Australians. Nurse perhaps being what the name for someone who had been a nanny when someone was young, but they'd retained in their service. And they, of course, being Australians, they covered up the crime. And Lady Mary says, I was brought up in the freer, less conventional atmosphere of South Australia, and this English life with proprieties and primness is not congenial to me. And of course, the nurse herself was an interesting person, a stern Australian nurse, taciturn, suspicious, ungracious. So really see this casting of negativities. And perhaps Holly Peters captures that best. Lady Frances Carfax goes missing. Turns out she's been the victim of a confidence trickster. That confidence trickster turns out to be Australian. And Holmes rescues Lady Carfax from a coffin. The perpetrator of this crime turns out not to be a missionary from South America, but apparently an Australian who can do really good accents. It's a guy named Holly Peters, one of the most unscrupulous rascals that Australia ever evolved. And it's turned out some very finished types. He beguiles young ladies, and he has a scar in the form of a chunk of ear missing. He was badly bitten in a saloon fight in Adelaide in '89, and Australians don't tend to call bars saloons. In fact, I've never heard of it, but I believe that this may have been the result of the plan for Holly Peters in the original draft of the story to have been from America, not from Australia. And you can see a representation over here of the Australian Holly Peters. So there are illustrations of Australians that accompany these. So we have some nice themes in the canon that I think we've seen a few times during those stories and the brief summaries I gave you. Certainly convicts and crime, and the convict stain, which is doesn't really exist anymore. But the convict stain was literally the stain on oneself, being descended from, the daughter of the son of a convict or the grandchild of a convict. It was a deeply shameful thing that tend to be covered up. That's gone away now, and people take pride in having convict ancestors. I think I have about 7 convict ancestors. Mutiny and escape, criminals escaping, return to England and redemption, and the redemption of crime, bushrangers, gold and fortunes made, and colonialism and that relationship back to the mother country. But particularly when it comes to criminals and escape, we see this element a few more times in the canon outside of Australian references. Of course, Jonathan Small, in The Sign of Four, who had escaped to and returned to England from the Andaman Islands, in this case for vengeance, and Selden in The Hound of the Baskervilles, who genuinely was a criminal and had escaped. So, when I was younger and before I was a Sherlockian, the kind of things that used to always amaze me about the stories were questions like, why don't Holmes and Watson ever express surprise at meeting Australians? So there's never a bit in a story they're like, oh my God, that person's from the other side of the world. I can't believe this. Just doesn't happen. So, obviously there's a comfort in English life with interacting with Australians and people, colonials, and that makes sense. There was an incredible amount of traffic back and forth. What inspired Conan Doyle's depictions of Australia and Australians in the home stories, and how is he tapping into English understandings of what it meant to be from Australia? And other timings of these historically appropriate. It's very easy to take a look at photos and see that and cross-reference what Conan Doyle was invoking and see that there really is a lot of direct and appropriate capturing of the Australian landscape and Australian people. This photograph, which was taken in 1861. It's a glass plate negative in Ballarat. Easily shows what I think we all imagine that was being described by Watson when he said he'd seen something like this on the side of a hill. Really quite remarkable the way the land has been picked over, turned over, and the leavings sitting on the side of the hill here. And we have to ask, as I said, if the story timelines work. So for those of you who may not be deeply passionate about Australian history, I'll just give you a few time points to help fix and fit these things in. So Australia was settled by the British in 1788. They did decide to establish a penal colony in Australia because they no longer had the ability to send indentured servants to the United States. They'd lost that after the War of Independence. And so Australia turned up after a few different ideas were explored as the option and the opportunity. James Cook had suggested that it was a good opportunity to settle. And so they took advantage of that over a decade later. Between then and around 1868, about 160,000 convicts were transported to Australia. About 24,000 of those were female, so there was an incredible gender imbalance in Australia, especially early on during settlement. And only about 40,000 of them were Irish. And I often find when Americans talk to me about convicts, there's a belief that they must be Irish, but most of them were English. There were a small number of political prisoners who were sent from countries including Canada and Ireland. Rather than death, they would be transported to Australia. By 1840, transportation to Sydney in New South Wales had stopped. And Sydney's here in New South Wales. And at the time, these were colonies. Australia was not a country. Each of these were colonies: Queen Victoria, Queensland and Victoria, New South Wales, the original one as named, and then South Australia, which doesn't look very south here. It looks very middle, and Western Australia. And down here we have Tasmania, or Van Diemen, as it was called, Van Diemen's Land, actually renamed to Tasmania partly to get away from the convict and criminal connotations of what Van Diemen's Land meant. And Australia's large. This is it overlaid with the United States. And you can see, in terms of breadth and height, it's roughly similar to mainland or continental United States. Around 1851, the gold rush started. Gold had been discovered. By then, certainly there was free immigration to Australia, and people really rushed to Australia because of the promise and the opportunity of a better life. And it's probably not surprising to hear that transportation of convicts stopped in 1868, but it really had stopped very, very soon after the gold rush started on the East Coast, where the gold rush had begun, because Australia went from somewhere that people were horrified to be sent to somewhere people really, really wanted to get to. And then, as I said, in 1901, Australia became a country. So it was really midway through the canon that this happened. The gold rush was so important for Britain that in the 1850s, the gold exported to Britain from Australia paid off all of Britain's foreign debts. So this wasn't just about individuals seeking their fortune. This really made a fortune for the entire British Empire. And these timelines do work. And this is an example of a convict ancestor of mine, George Bliss. These people are closer in living memory than you might realize. Only one generation away, really, now. George Bliss, a lovely name, was born in 1819 in Kent. He was transported in 1839 for stealing beef. In 1850, he married, and he had 12 children between 1852 and 1880. So a 28-year period of fathering children with his wife. Ultimately, in 1854, he received a conditional pardon. The condition on conditional pardons is that you never return to England. You could not return. If you did, the best case scenario was being sentenced to Australia for life. The worst case scenario was being hung. Both of those outcomes certainly took place. And he died in 1915. So really in the 20th century, where he worked on a farm, age 96. And you can see he could, in his obituary, his very small obituary, he could relate stirring events of the early diggings and the old bushranging days. Now, it doesn't mention that he could relate stirring events of being a convict. As I mentioned, the convict stain very much existed in 1915, but it just shows the historical reach of people through living memory and overlaps with almost the entire canon here. The last expiry that believed to have died in Australia was in 1938, aged 105. So quite a really remarkable overlap there. So in terms of Australia and its experience in the British consciousness, I just wanted to point out a few as I move towards the end of the talk here. One that's, I think, fairly obvious to a lot of people on this call, but one I'm still learning about is E.W. Horning. He was Conan Doyle's brother-in-law. When he was about 17, he traveled to Australia for the climate. I have ancestors who I was told would travel to Australia for the climate and for their health, and it really was a superior climate to Britain. Happy to answer questions about that comment in the Q&A time. He only lived in Australia for 2 years before he returned home, and he was much healthier. He was an author. He published multiple books that described Australia and the Australian bush and the Australian farmland. After returning home, of course, he met Conan Doyle playing cricket, married Conan Doyle's wife, Constance, or Connie, and several books he published on convicts, the Rogues March, all the while being related to Conan Doyle, and one can imagine conversations taking place there. In fact, he also wrote a story about a bushranger, an Oxford-educated Australian gentleman thief, which unfortunately, I don't want to plot spoil this one, but unfortunately, he wasn't able to use this character in subsequent books, and he was told it was a real shame he hadn't kept this gentleman thief to serialize, and he later created Raffles to do exactly that. Dickens had two sons who emigrated to Australia. He planned to visit, and while Dickens, of course, passed away well before Conan Doyle got into his literary career. Dickens, of course, had a massive influence on Victorian British literature, but also nonfiction. He published a book, a weekly journal called Household Words. There were well over 100 articles about various aspects of Australia in those that fill up 5 volumes of these books. They've all been reprinted and republished, and people read those. But of course, he also, along with all of those nonfiction stories of various aspects of Australian life, where Dickens really saw an opportunity for Britain's poor to be sent, and there was a scheme for that, or to move to Australia to better themselves. Multiple characters in Dickens' novels um, uh, end up in Australia one way or another. Of course, many are where convicts are sent. John Edmonds in Pickwick Papers, Mr. Squeers and Nicholas Dickleby. Uriah Heep, of course, ends up that way, waiting to be transported in David Copperfield. But there's also the opportunity for a better life in exactly the same stories. And in fact, in David Copperfield, Mr. Peggotty takes Emily to a new life in Australia with others, where they all find security and happiness. Again, common themes that we see through Dickens's literature, all the way through Dickens's literature. And perhaps my favorite, of course, is probably many people's favorites, is Great Expectations, where the transportation of a convict who starts the story on a hulk in Kent, ultimately transported to Australia, has a number of jobs, becomes quite wealthy, returns home to thank young Pippin and to pass along his property. Magwitch was a deported criminal. And of course, coming back to England was risky, as Dickens captured in the story. As I said, he could be sentenced to death for exactly that. If anyone's interested in Dickens's articles about Australia, the Charles Dickens Australia book series is really magnificent. But there are also Australian novels that made it to Britain in the decades prior to, and stories that made it to Britain in the decade prior to when Conan Doyle was starting the Sherlock Holmes stories. Two of them that really received a lot of attention. One was For the Term of His Natural Life, which is best described as a saga about a convict convicted to transportation for the term of his natural life. That was the standard sentence. And this wonderful story, which it does include, of course, the desire to return to England. And The Mystery of the Hansom Cab, one of my favorite stories ever by Fergus Hume, was published in 1886 and sold over 500,000 copies, and was very much the story before Study in Scarlet that a lot of people in England had read. A murder that takes place in a hansom cab, and you can just see a person with a chloroformed cloth smothered over their face there in a hansom cab running through the streets of Melbourne. And I guess the last piece here of real strong influence on the British consciousness and their understanding of Australia and literature was Anthony Trollope, who of course was a novelist, but also a great observer and a great traveler. He had a son who also immigrated to Australia to establish a farm, and Trollope decided and did visit him. In fact, he visited twice. The first trip was in 1871, and he was up there for about a year. He wrote a story, he wrote a book, a nonfiction travelogue of that visit called Australia and New Zealand. It turned out to be quite controversial. He wasn't always positive about Australia, and it was received poorly in Australia. He described the time there as being spent descending mines, mixing with shearers and rouseabouts, riding his horse into the loneliness of the bush, touring lunatic asylums, and exploring coast and plain by steamer and stagecoach. So quite a very variable number of activities here, but I think all of these really capture and intersect with the kind of things that Conan Doyle invokes and that you think about when you think about those canonical descriptions of Australia and Australians. He did say in that book that the traveller does not hear much about convicts, but that doesn't mean that there weren't convicts in Australia. As I've said, this is 1871. Transportation was still taking place to the western side of Australia, and there were many convicts still serving out terms, still being punished on the eastern coast of Australia, including Tasmania and Van Diemen's Land. And there's an opportunity to see what a convict looks like. It might not occur to people, but the convicts that were transported to Australia, of course, most of them were never photographed. Most of them were transported before photography. But, as convicts served out their sentence into the latter half of the 19th century, many of them were photographed, and some of those photographs remain. And this is one example of a convict named Dennis Doherty, and it'll be clear why I picked him in a moment. Dennis Doherty was convicted by a court-martial. He was actually in the 95th Regiment and 16th Lancers, and he was court-martialed for desertion and mutiny. So that was his crime, and rather than death, that was commuted to life in Australia. He was also charged with treason and sedition for attempting to blow up the barracks. So there's a political criminal element to Dennis Doherty and his activities. He arrived in Sydney in 1833 on board a ship called the Aurora, which sailed to Australia multiple times, and remained a convict for the rest of his life. This photograph was taken around 1874, so it gives you an opportunity to see what a convict looked like and sort of cast this real photograph of a convict. There are many of these, and back against the stories you've read of Sherlock and how you imagine them in your mind. There's quite a detailed description of him in 1871, around the time actually that Anthony Trollope met Dennis Doherty, which is why I'm showing you this example. When Trollope visited Australia, he was taken to Tasmania, and he wanted to meet some convicts and to hear their stories. So he was taken to this convict settlement and met Dennis Doherty, who had recently escaped. And there's some descriptions of him here that I'm not going to read out, but I know that you can read. But you can see, of course, that along with traditional descriptions, he'd lost the sight of his right eye, and that may be slightly evident in this reversed photograph here. He also had a number of tattoos. Some of the different things that one might expect to see in a convict, they're all here. The really amazing thing about Dennis Doherty isn't that Trollope met him, and not that we have a photograph of him, which is a really nice intersection of two historical records, but we also have the opportunity to hear his voice. And so I'll finish by reading a little bit from Trollope's book and give you a sense of this one convict while you take a close look at his face here. And hear what he was like and reflect on how this matches the way we see convicts in Conan Doyle's stories. He really was a master at sort of channeling reality. There was an Irishman with one eye named Doherty who told us that for 42 years he had never been a free man for an hour. He'd been transported for mutiny when hardly more than a boy, for he had enlisted as a boy and had since that time received nearly 3,000 lashes. In appearance, he was a large man and still powerful, well to look at in spite of his eye, lost, as he told us, through the misery of prison life. But he said that he was broken at last. If they would only treat him kindly, he would be as a lamb. But within the last few weeks, he had escaped, and with 3 others had been brought back almost starved to death. The record of his prison life was frightful. He'd been always escaping, always rebelling, always fighting against authority, and always being flogged. There had been a whole life of torment such as this, 42 years of it, and there he stood, speaking softly, arguing his case well, and pleading while the tears ran down his face for some kindness, for some mercy in his old age. I have tried to escape, always to escape, he said, as a bird does out of a cage. Is that unnatural? Is that a great crime? The man's first offense, that of mutiny, is not one at which the mind revolts. I did feel for him, and when he spoke of himself as a caged bird, I should have liked to take him out into the world and give him a month of comfort. He would probably, however, have knocked my brains out on the first opportunity. I was assured he was thoroughly bad, irredeemable, not to be reached by any kindness, a beast of prey, whose hand was against every honest man, and against whom it was necessary that every honest man should raise his hand. Yet he talked so gently and so well, and argued his own case with such winning words. He was writing in a book when we entered his cell, and was engaged on some speculation as to the tonnage of vessels. Just scribbling, sir, he said, to while away the hours. So I hope that that little piece there at the end gave you a sense of how similar some of these convicts really were to the depictions in the Conan Doyle stories. And I really appreciate you listening to me today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.